The regime forces target protesters in Der'a, Aleppo and Damascus, causing casualties. Forty people were killed today, while hundreds of protest points are recorded. General Mood says that a military solution might be taken instead of a peaceful transition in Syria. Good evening and welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. Syrians began their demonstrations today since early morning hours, repeating their demands for freedom and dignity. The first demonstrations began in the capital Damascus from the neighborhoods of Mazza and Al-Midan, while in Aleppo, people in the towns of Al-Ashrafiyya, Salah ad-Din, Ain al-Arab and Bustan al-Qasr took to the streets today in mass demonstrations. Meanwhile, Idlib demonstrations took place in the city of Ma'arat al-Nu'man and in the towns of Has, Al-Habit and Sirmin, and also in the city of Saraqib. Also, several demonstrations went out in the city of Jericho and other towns, demanding the overthrow of the regime and calling the international community to take action towards what is happening in Syria. They also demanded from the international community to stop the regime's violent attacks. Several people were killed and others were wounded, including a woman and her daughter, after the regime bombarded the town of Ma'ar Shamarin in Idlib suburbs. Meanwhile, the citizens of Kfar Nabil, Ariha, Salqin and Binish and many other towns took to the streets in mass demonstrations to condemn the international silence over the crimes in Syria and to demand freedom and the overthrow of the regime. And with us through Skype to comment on the situation in Idlib, Omar Abu al-Huda, a media activist from Idlib. Mr. Omar, welcome. And first of all, I want to ask you, the shelling is now taking place in Hish and Khan Sheikhoun. What can you tell us about this shelling?
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Firstly, compassion for the soul of our martyrs, healing for the wounded, and the freedom of detainees in Assad jail. I will talk at first about what's happening now in Sarmada. One martyr women were killed by the effect of shelling on Sarmada. They were shelling on Sarmada by tanks and also by rockets on civilian houses. And till now, one martyr, a woman and her son were injured. Also, there are tens of injured people affected by the shelling by tanks and rockets on civilian houses on Sarmada, by tanks which are located in Bab al-Hawa checkpoints. And Sarmada are blocked by tanks, and maybe we are afraid of any carnage will happen in Sarmada. Also in Khan Sheikhoun, it's usually every day shelling on civilian houses, and they are destroyed over 10 houses till now. This happening every day in Idlib.
Okay. Omar, you told us about the scale of destruction. I want to ask you about the number of casualties until now. If you have a specific number, you can tell us.
About specific number, no, I don't have specific number about what's happening. I have because you cannot make a specific statistic about what's happening, because as you see by videos which are distributed by activists, the shelling are continuous still now in different areas on Khan Sheikhoun, on Sarmada and Kfar Nabil. Also in Kfar Nabil, where there are one martyr, Bassam Hazza. Also there we have one martyr from Darkush, Abdul Mu'ti Hassan Abdul Qadir. He was killed by Assad brigade in Salah ad-Din, while he was in demonstration in Salah ad-Din.
Thank
also,
you.
Let me give you.
Okay, go ahead, Omar. Please, the final point, because our time is short.
Excuse me, I want to talk about Ma'arat al-Nu'man. 15 soldiers defected from a checkpoint in Ma'arat al-Nu'man.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Omar Abu al-Huda, a media activist from Idlib. Despite the spread of military tanks and snipers, the citizens of Hama and its suburbs took to the streets in demonstrations against the regime, where images broadcasted by activists show populated protests in Al-Alaylat, Al-Hamidiyya and Al-Sabuniyya, which expanded to Asilmiya, Kafr Nbuda and Murik, where people demanded freedom and condemned the Russian support for the Syrian regime. The siege continues on the city of Al-Atamina in Hama for the 7th consecutive day, while the number of detainees, according to the local coordination committees, reached more than 400 prisoners of all ages. Meanwhile, the security forces proceeded to burning crops and agricultural land to torture the citizens and to make them starve.
هذا الحادث التابع لعصابات بشار الأسد قام بحرق كل ما تبقى.
Moving on to the capital Damascus, where these suburbs witnessed heavy military campaigns today that led to the fall of tens of victims as well as injuring many others. We see more about the updates in Damascus in the following report.
Allahu Akbar. Medina Duma.
Dozens were killed today in Rif Damascus as the regime's army carried out military campaigns where the general public is in awe to the similarities of destruction between what occurred in the suburbs and what had already been caused in Homs. The town of Masraba witnessed fierce military campaigns where the regime bombarded the town using mortar shells, which burned several houses. This caused the fall of a victim as well as leaving dozens wounded. This bombardment comes along with the disconnection of roads, electricity and all communication methods. Moreover, just like other cities in Syria, the security and guerrilla forces of the regime caused 2 massacres in the cities of Hamuriya and Zamalka, where the regime literally slaughtered some civilians, according to witnesses. At night, the regime forces targeted evening demonstrations in Al-Zabadani, where the regime randomly shot at protesters, causing many injuries between the civilians that are currently in intensive care. Meanwhile, in Al-Damir, Daraya, Mu'adhamiyat al-Sham and Artuz, the regime also shot civilians randomly, along with using mortar shells, which was followed by the arrival of military reinforcements. This was also the case in Qalamun, Hosh Arab and Asr al-Ward in the capital Damascus, where the rebels came out in massive protests to confirm their loyalty to the revolution.
The citizens of Al-Jubr neighborhood held a funeral for several victims who were killed by the regime's military campaigns. The citizens of Al-Salihiyya also held a funeral for the victim Nabil Al-Sabbagh during massive protests. Meanwhile, an explosion shook Al-Maydaniya neighborhood, which resulted in many injuries. The city of Hamuriya witnessed a new massacre after the security forces entered it. This massacre resulted in the death of several victims and the wounding of many. According to activists, most of the victims were slaughtered inside their farms. The security forces also attacked women during their raids on houses, while the bombardment continued on the neighborhoods of Duma, while the cities of Rankus and Asal Ward were exposed to heavy shelling after the defection of a number of soldiers in Hala. And to Homs, where demonstrations took place today in Al-Rastan and Al-Hula, Tildu, Kafarlaha, Tel Dahab and At-Tiba. Meanwhile, the neighborhoods of Al-Mal'ab and Al-Wa'ar went out to support affected cities while they demanded the overthrow of Al-Assad regime. And staying in Homs, where shelling was renewed since the early morning hours on the old districts of Homs, especially the neighborhoods of Al-Khalidiyya and Jobar. The bombardment also reached Al-Husn Castle on the cities of Al-Qusayr and Tilbisa, where the houses of civilians were targeted randomly, which led to burning several houses. And coming up later in the bulletin, Lavrov denies that Moscow is in talks with the West on the post-Assad period. And welcome back. You're watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. In Daraa, demonstrations went out in several towns, including Al-Yaduda, Atman, Dir al-Mahatta, Mlehat al-Atish, and in the town of Nasib and the city of Khirbat Ghazala, Al-Sabil, Al-Naima, Al-Sahwa, and Al-Jiza, where protesters took to the streets in protest to condemn the regime's massacres and to support the rebellious cities, demanding the overthrow of the regime. A new massacre was committed by the regime's army in Busra Sham in Daraa suburbs, where dozens of victims were killed due to the mortar shelling that was fired on a demonstration and that was taking place. And staying in Daraa, where more than 7 victims fell today when the security forces opened fire on a demonstration in Busra Sham, while the forces raided the National Hospital and detained a number of nurses because of their participation in the treatment of injured citizens, and mortar shelling continued in Busra al-Harir. Meanwhile, the regime's aircraft continued to shell Lajat area. And on the other hand, citizens in Al-Heat went out to mourn their victims in a funeral, as the images show. The citizens of Daraa bid farewell to their children who were killed by the regime forces. This comes as the regime forces continues to bombard the province. We see more about Daraa in this following report.
The citizens of Daraa bid their farewells to their loved ones who were killed by the regime, who has been carrying out heavy military campaigns that targeted women, men and children with no exceptions. The citizens of Daraa resort to hiding in what they think are safe rooms to prevent them from being killed.
لا خوف عنان ولا للجامعة العربية ولا في إسلام خافوا من الله.
But that doesn't help, as the regime targets all buildings with no exceptions using tanks, mortars and military planes, which only increases the death toll every day. The regime also continues to increase its troops, its road barriers and camps to protect itself from alleged terrorist groups and to oppress their protests. As the shooting stops for a little while, the citizens hold their funerals in different provinces and areas of the city for their victims, who are now compared to those killed in occupied Palestine. However, these funerals turn into night demonstrations that celebrate and commemorate their promise to achieve freedom. The rebels of Daraa are now convinced that the revolution is different than other countries due to the victims lost and the duration of their loyalty to achieve the freedom that they have long waited for.
To the province of Aleppo, where the citizens in the towns of Kafr Hamra, Hriditan, Raitan and Darat Azza witnessed heavy shelling from the artillery and tanks belonging to the regime's army, which led to the displacement of many citizens from these areas. Meanwhile, the shelling was renewed on the city of Andan, with the lack in the electrical power and the shortage of food supplies. On the other hand, evening demonstrations in the neighborhoods of Salah ad-Din, Bustan al-Qasr, Al-Sukkari, Beni Zaid and Al-Ashrafiyya went out in solidarity with the affected cities, while protesters demanded the overthrow of the regime. Meanwhile, massive demonstrations took place today in Aleppo, where thousands of demonstrators went out in the neighborhoods of Salah ad-Din, Al-Sakhur, Al-Hamdaniya and Al-A'damiya to demand the overthrow of Al-Assad's regime and to condemn Russia's support. Meanwhile, the regime shot at demonstrators, resulting in the fall of the 2 victims and many wounded and captured. In the city of Atarib in Aleppo suburbs, the citizens took to the streets in mass demonstrations despite the suffocating oppression and daily bombardment that the city suffers. Meanwhile, mass demonstrations went out in Azaz and Tel Rifat, which demanded freedom and the overthrow of the regime, as well as condemning the international silence over the massacres committed. The regime forces carried out massive military campaigns in Aleppo and its suburbs, where many lands and buildings were burned down. More details about Aleppo we see in the following report.
In Aleppo suburbs, the towns of Al-Atarib, Kafar Hamra, Hardatain, Raitan and Darat Azza witnessed military campaigns that bombarded the towns using mortar shells and heavy weaponry, which resulted in the displacement of many citizens. Aleppo is a city in Syria, whose rebels consider the heart and the main reason to the continuation and persistence of the revolution in Syria.
الله أكبر عليك يا بشار. والله يا عرب يا عرب يا مسلمين يا خواني يا متخاذلين.
Andan as well, and yet again, was also bombarded as the regime continued cutting the electricity and causing a shortage of food supplied due to the military besiegement that surrounded the entire city. Meanwhile, the cities of Al-Bab and Al-Atarib lost 3 citizens today who were killed by the security and guerrilla forces of the regime, to which the citizens and traders of Aleppo retaliated by holding strikes, which can cause a lot of economic losses since Aleppo is Syria's capital of economics. This picture, broadcasted by activists from Al-Atarib, shows the military forces burning agricultural lands through their military campaign of scorched land. And despite all the violations committed, the rebels of Aleppo decide to surround the regime from the north, as they are as well surrounded from the south in Dar'a, to suffocate its machine and to achieve freedom.
الله أكبر عليك يا بشار.
The local coordinating committees in the city of Al-Hasaka said that the regime forces fired at demonstrators that came out in the neighborhoods of Al-Ghwayran, as well as carrying out arrest campaigns in the city. This comes at a time where demonstrations came out in Amuda and Ad-Dirbasiyya that demanded freedom and the overthrow of the regime. In the city of Al-Qamishli in Al-Hasaka suburbs, protests came out in a special Friday where demonstrators condemned the Russian support to the Syrian regime, as well as holding a prototype of Bashar al-Assad being hung for his crimes. Meanwhile, the citizens of Ras Al Ain came out in protests against al-Assad's regime. And coming up later in the bulletin, Lavrov denies that Moscow is in talks with the West on the post-Assad period. The regime's army targeted a demonstration in Busra Sham, a city in Dar'a, with mortar shells, which resulted in the death of at least 8 citizens. According to activists, the regime threatened the protesters that if they went out in a demonstration, they will kill them. Meanwhile, the number of victims is likely to increase due to the difficulty of transferring the wounded victims to the hospitals because of the spread of military checkpoints in the city. Politically, the fourth commander of the UN observers in Syria, Major General Robert Mood, said today that there was a trend towards military gains rather than the desire for a peaceful transition in Syria. The Norwegian general believes that there is a lack of desire for a peaceful transition, and instead there is a rush in the direction of progress to strengthen the military sides. He added that violence during the past 10 days has increased the desire of both parties as well as causing losses on both sides, which represents a significant risk to the observers' mission.
Civilians are suffering.
The Syrian issue topped the talks that were held between the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and his Iraqi counterpart Hoshyar Zebari. Lavrov called on all parties in Syria to have a dialogue without any outside interference, stressing the need to implement Annan's plan because it is the foundation to meet the aspirations of Syrians and secure democracy. From his side, Zebari stressed the need to increase the pressure on all sides to implement Annan's plan.
Если это действительно было сказано, то это неправда. Таких дискуссий не ведется и не будет.
The Human Rights Watch held the Syrian regime responsible for the use of sexual violence to torture men, women and children in detention centers. This is based on interviews conducted by the Organization for the Defense of the Human Rights with 10 former detainees who said that they were imprisoned for their involvement in the protests. The director of the Organization for the Middle East said that the sexual violence while in custody is one of the many weapons in the rise of terrible torture of the Syrian government, which is used regularly to humiliate the detainees before setting them free. The International Committee of the Red Cross confirmed that it was working around the clock to provide food and medical assistance to thousands of civilians who have fled the escalating violence in Syria. It added that water engineers are trying to update their personal supply lines or deliver clean drinking water for the displaced residents in the troubled areas of Homs and Al-Hula. The Deputy Secretary General of the Arab League, Ambassador Ahmed bin Hli, revealed that the Arab League and the United Nations will be in touch for their conference for the International Contact Group before the end of this month in Geneva to discuss ways to resolve the crisis and frameworks of Syria. He also added in remarks published in the Middle East newspaper that Russia proposed to hold an international conference with the participation of Iran and the neighboring countries of Syria to discuss the risks taking place in the Syrian arena now. He also confirmed that whoever bets on the security solution and the military displays, the future of the Syrian state will collapse, pointing out that the solution must be the decision of Syria with the support of the Arab countries. And before we end up our bulletin, here's a reminder of today's main stories. The regime forces target protesters in Daraa, Aleppo and Damascus, causing casualties. 40 people were killed today while hundreds of protest points were recorded. General Mood says that a military solution might be taken instead of a peaceful transition in Syria. And with this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. Thank you for watching us, and you can join us tomorrow at the same time. Goodbye.